Hello and welcome to week 2 of Restored. I'm so glad that you're with us or you're walking through this process of restoration. Last week we talked about the very basics of restoration, God's intention from the very beginning of time to walk us through a process of restoration. It's God's intention for us, but it's also His intention for us and other people, that we would be restored to each other, we'd be restored to God, and ultimately that God would restore it all under His mercy and grace. So we looked at Micah chapter 6, verse 8. Today we're actually looking at Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, and we're going to really talk about going weightless. How do we offload the weight of guilt? Now you're maybe thinking, well, I didn't hurt anybody. I was the one that was hurt. You're right. So you don't necessarily have guilt, but how do you apply God's mercy? How do you apply restoration so that the other person, they go weightless? And that really is what God's called you to do. Isn't that what Jesus has done for us? That He has removed our guilt, not because we deserve it, but because He desires it for us. He's a weight lifter, in a sense, I guess. So I was thinking about this whole idea of guilt, and I don't know how you grew up. I grew up in a very strict Pentecostal, I hate to say legalistic, but that might be what it was, legalistic home. In any event, my parents did a great job. They are the best parents I could ever hope for. But, you know, they applied the letter of the law pretty well, and it kept me straight. And actually, I'm grateful for that. But there was one time I went to junior high camp. I loved camp as a kid. I loved going to camp for a week and, roughing it, sort of, eating food that wasn't very good. Mostly, I just loved hanging out with my friends. But I remember this one particular camp. It was a junior high camp, and I had met these people that became fast friends, 2 or 3 girls and another guy, and I didn't really know them before the camp, but I got to know them after the days went on. And there was one evening that they suggested, hey, why don't we ditch the chapel service? Let's ditch it, and we'll go up in the little hills and play truth or dare. Well, I don't know if you know what truth or dare is. Essentially, it becomes more dare than truth. But that's what we did. So we ditched, and we went up there and did a little kissing and a little hugging. And, I thought, I'm all good. I get back to the cabin. My counselor is asleep. Probably figured I was, praying at the altar or who knows something. But he didn't seem to bother with me not being there. And I wake up the next morning. I go to breakfast, and I find out that one of the girls that was with us confessed everything to the counselor. Everything. Like all the kissing and hugging and everything. I just knew that was the end. I just knew that somehow that I was going to get in so much trouble. But you know what happened? Nothing. The youth pastor never came and talked to me. No one said a word to me. And she confessed names. So I just was sure that trouble was coming. But nope, nothing. I got home. Still, I couldn't shake the guilt. Every time the phone rang, it was before cell phones, but every time the phone rang, I would listen intently thinking it was my youth pastor calling my dad or mom to tell them the evil things I did at junior high camp. That went on for weeks. I had a wave of guilt that just came over me every time the phone rang. Finally, I don't know, my junior high distraction took over and I forgot about the whole thing. I never got called on the carpet for that, poor act of, judgment. And you know what, as I look back on it, I actually wish I had. I wish my youth pastor had to actually talk to me right that week when I was at camp, because then the guilt would have been over. That guilt that I was experiencing went on for weeks at a time. It was a weight that I just couldn't bear. And so that's what we're talking about, is we're talking about how you can go weightless. How do you get past the guilt and get to a step towards restoration? Jesus offers This is an illustration in his Sermon on the Mount. And look at the screen and follow along with me as I read Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 through 26. Here's what Jesus says in the middle of his Sermon on the Mount. He says, "You have heard that it is said to people long ago, 'You shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment.' But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to his brother or sister, 'Raca,' is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, 'You fool,' will be in danger of the fire of hell. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, and then come and offer your gift." So Jesus, he shares this, this idea. I mean, it's an interesting idea. He says, if, you've heard it said, he pulls out the sixth commandment. You heard it said that, you should not commit murder. And he takes it to another level. He says, it's more than that. If you are angry with a brother, an unresolved anger, or you call them raca, or you call them a fool, I mean, that's just like murder. So what is Jesus saying here? Well, he's saying that there is this weight of guilt that we all bear because we're not guiltless. We do things wrong all the time. So why do we carry guilt? Why did I carry guilt for weeks as a junior hire? I wish that was the only time I carried guilt. I've done a good job carrying a lot of guilt in my life. But let me share with you some reasons why I think we carry guilt in our life. First of all, we carry guilt because our past mistakes become labels. Our past mistakes become labels for us. They aren't just something we did or a mistake we made. It becomes who we are. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 11, the Apostle Paul, writing to the believers in Corinth, prior to this verse 11, he gives this whole list of things that people do, really bad things, adulterers and fornicators, and he kind of goes on this whole list of really bad things. But then he says in chapter 6, verse 11, "And that is what some of you were." And I think that's important. What Paul is saying, he's saying to the Corinthians, you're not that anymore. You were that, but don't wear that label anymore. That's not your label. Your label is that you're a Christ follower. You are a child of the King. You're a prince or a princess. You belong to God. You are His. You belong to Him. You're no longer what you were. That label ceases to exist anymore. I think another reason why we carry the weight of guilt is because we don't believe we created a problem. We believe we are the problem. We think the problem is us. So you never get away from that. It's not like you created a problem. It's not like you made a mistake or you did something wrong. No, you are a mistake. And you can see how that just weighs you down more and more and more. See, the problem is wherever you go, there you are. And if you're the problem, you never get free from it. I think a third reason why we sometimes feel the weight of guilt is because, well, we've never found the balance between taking responsibility and letting go. And I'll be honest with you, that is a really difficult balance to strike. When have you taken enough responsibility that you've taken enough and it's over, you don't need to take any more? And when is it okay to let go, to sort of let yourself off the hook? Well, if you've sinned, you don't want to let yourself off the hook. You feel like somehow you're responsible. So you keep taking responsibility. The problem with that is when we don't find a way to be responsible, but then process towards letting go, we keep taking responsibility. As the Bible says, we keep putting Jesus on the cross for the same sin, and we never get free from that. So I think it's important. I mentioned it to you in the first session that restoration is a theme, a major theme in the Bible. And the church has not done a great job of being restorative in its nature. That is the problem we're looking at right now. The problem with without a well-planned process of restoration, without walking people through it, what ends up happening is we get stuck in the midst of our guilt and we never get free. So we sit in the pews or we sit in the chairs and we live with this weight of guilt on us that we can't ever break free from. That is not the abundant life that God promised us in John 10:10. That is not what it takes to be restorative. I think here's the fourth and final reason, and maybe there's a lot of reasons, but here's the ones that I'll point out today. I think we offer a passive confession and wind up with fraudulent restoration. Yeah, it's a passive confession. Well, I did something wrong, but everybody sins. Everybody messes up. Well, yes, everybody does. And the point is for you to own what you have and not to take it passively. You can become so passive about it, not take responsibility in a seriousness of it, that the restoration that you get, or maybe the loss of guilt that you might feel, is fraudulent. And then over time, what ends up happening is it comes back wave after wave. What Jesus does in this portion of Scripture that we read at the beginning, what Jesus does on the Sermon on the Mount is he really points a path towards freedom. And he starts out by using an illustration that every Jewish person that was listening would understand. He talks about the sixth of the 10 Commandments, murder. I mean, a serious one that most people, I'm assuming that most of us even watching this video right now would say, yeah, that's not me. So I don't have any guilt with the sixth commandment, but 1 and 2 may be a problem for me. But number 6, that's not me. Jesus does this. He brings it to the fore and says, well, I don't think you're understanding the guilt that we bear in this. Now, I want you to understand that Jesus wasn't taking the 10 Commandments and applying moral legalism to it. Because that's what I see us doing oftentimes is if I even think an angry thought, well, I've committed murder, now I've violated the commandments. Jesus is not doing that. He's not trying to add layers onto the 10 Commandments so that there's greater legalism that we have to abide by. Instead, what he's trying to do is help us to understand our guilt, but then find a pathway towards going weightless, lifting the weight of guilt off of us. So here's what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to write this down. Here's the first pathway to going weightless when it comes to guilt. First, write this down. Identify your offenses when they are small and acknowledge them early. So let me say that again. Identify your offenses when they are small and acknowledge them early. So if we want to be guiltless, the way towards really dealing with guilt is to nip it in the bud, to get it early when they're small. And that's what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying, so you haven't committed murder, good for you. I mean, that's 99% of the people have not committed murder, maybe more, right? He's saying, no, but when you do these things, when you use the word fool, in other words, you dehumanize a person, or you say raka, you reject a person. When you've done this, when you're angry to the point of there's no resolution, you have committed the sin that leads to murder. No one wakes up one day and says, I'm going to murder somebody. Well, maybe some people do, but for the most part, nobody wakes up and then murders somebody. It's a process. It builds over time. It starts with the process that Jesus mentions, that we're angry with them. There's unresolved anger, and then it becomes towards ultimate rejection. When we use the word raka, which is a Aramaic word. It's like this, I reject you. And then finally, you fool, which you dehumanize, you dismiss them. This is what Hitler did with the Jews. He dehumanized them, not just for himself, but really for an entire people in Germany. They were so dehumanized that murder was acceptable, understandable, believable, and possible. So what do we do? How do we catch the sin early? We do what David did. David said in Psalms 139, he says, I'm not going to be fooled into thinking that I know myself really well. You know who lies to you the most? You know the person that lies to you more than anyone else? You. You lie to yourself more than anyone else. And we can easily deceive ourselves. And so what David says is this. David says, search me, O God. Expose my heart. See if there are any anxious thoughts in me. Lead me to the way everlasting. So he's saying, search me, God, because I don't always know me. Reveal in me the things that I'm not even aware are there. So this is what Jesus is saying. If we don't want to live with this cloud of guilt, find it, discover it, know it, have it revealed to you when it's small, and then confess it. Get it out early. That's the pathway to being weightless when it comes to guilt. Now here's the second thing he mentions. I want you to write this down. When a relationship is broken, initiate the restoration. When a relationship is broken, initiate the restoration. This is what Jesus says. He's talking to these people. They're in Galilee, and he's giving this sermon, and then he uses this illustration. He says, all right, so I want you to go with me here. You're on the way to make a sacrifice. You're a male, and you're required as a male to bring a sacrifice, whatever you can afford. You bring it to the temple. So you do the journey, and it was not a small journey. It took days and days and days to get to Jerusalem from Galilee. Remember, he's not talking to people who are in Jerusalem. He's talking to people in Galilee. So they've taken the 10-day trip all the way to Jerusalem. Then, of course, it's one of the big festivals or feasts. And so there's a line of people. You're maybe waiting for hours in this line for your turn. And you get right up to the altar. You're right there. You're right about to, this long process, 10 days walking and, brutal heat or just brutal conditions, and you finally arrive and you stand in line and you're right there about ready to offer your gift, and there you remember, there's a broken relationship in my life. Maybe it's with your wife. I had an argument just before I went. She wanted me to take this sheep, and I took that sheep, and so we argued over which sheep to take. Or maybe it's a friend or a coworker, and you remember that they have something against you. You maybe have done something to harm them, or there's brokenness that you've caused. Somehow you are responsible for whatever is broken in that relationship. You know what you're supposed to do? According to Jesus, you leave your gift there. You just leave it at the altar, and you hightail it 10 days back to Galilee, and you go and make it right. So what's Jesus saying? Jesus is saying that it's so important to reconcile when something is broken, when you've harmed somebody, when you've damaged a relationship, when you've done something to hurt somebody. It's so important that prayers and church attendance and all the spiritual things that we do, all the things that we consider to be so spiritually important, we need to set that aside. And the most spiritual thing we can do is make things right with the person that we hurt. And when we do that, guilt comes off of us. That's what Jesus says. I remember being in Costco the other day, and there was this huge, long line. Maybe you've been in the same situation. It was a weekend, and so the line was ridiculously long. And I'm waiting, and I'm impatient, and I finally get to the front. It's my turn, and there I remember my wife wanted me to get something I failed to pick up. So I had this debate in my head. What do I do? Do I just go back and say, well, I forgot. That probably wouldn't go over well. Do I go back and say, they didn't have it? Well, that would make me feel guilty of lying. Do I go back and tell the truth and say I got all the way to the front and I just didn't want to go back and get it? Well, I decided that I'd leave my position in the front of the line, go back and get what my wife had asked me to get, go back and stand in the line all over again. It was terribly inconvenient. But you know what was really good? When I got home, my wife was pleased. And I didn't have to bear any guilt for lying or forgetting or not doing the right thing. That's kind of what Jesus is saying here. I'm going to put a quote on the screen. It's from John Calvin. John Calvin was a leader of the church in the Reformation. And he writes this: "For where do all injuries come from but from this, that each person is too demanding for his own rights, that each is too much disposed to consider his own convenience to the disadvantage of others. Almost all are so blinded by wicked love of themselves that even in the worst causes they flatter themselves that they are in the right." Now that leads us to the next part of the scripture that Jesus says, where he writes in verse 25 and 26, "Settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you are still together on the way, or your adversary may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. Truly I tell you, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny." So here's the point. When you're in the wrong, when you've done wrong, initiate restoration. Initiate reconciliation. Go and make it right. Even if it's terribly inconvenient. You know what the biggest inconvenience is? Me looking bad. Me looking like I'm wrong. And I don't like admitting I'm wrong. You probably don't like it either. But it's better than bearing the weight of guilt. And here's the third thing that Jesus says to us. Write this down. When possible, keep the matter between you and the offended or the offender. This is really important. Jesus, he doesn't say, okay, leave your sacrifice at the altar, tell a bunch of people what you did wrong or what they did wrong, broadcast it. He says, no, go directly to the person. Go find the person that has something against you and make it right between the two of you. There's a whole lot of value in that. I think what Jesus is saying is, I want you to resolve it between you two parties, because once a third party gets involved, restoration is far more difficult. When you get a third party involved, here's how it works. I mean, you know how this works, right? Somebody offends you, you start talking with other people about how they offended you, and they then validate why you should be really mad and angry and maybe never make things right or make it really difficult on things to be right. Or maybe you're the one that offended and you talk to other people about how offended the person got when you did almost nothing to make things bad or whatever. And so they support your position. And the more your position is supported, the more you dig in your position, and restoration becomes difficult. Reconciliation becomes so hard. So Jesus says this. He says, don't make it about anyone else. Make it about the two of you. Go and make it right with one another. So ultimately, Jesus is saying, set aside your pride and in humility, come back and make things right. So I'm going to encourage you in your small groups to gather together, walk through the questions, see how God wants to offload your guilt. And maybe you don't want to do this in your small group, but I would encourage you this week to set some time aside to pray quietly before the Lord and just say, God, search my heart. What's in me that I'm not aware of that needs to be cleaned up? Make me aware of what maybe I'm feeling guilty about and don't even know that I feel guilty about it. And then ask God to show you how to bring about restitution, reconciliation, and healing. God bless you. Have a great time in your groups.